Hello everyone, today we talk about Frederick I Barbarossa and his clash against the Lombard League and Henry the Lion. Recently we talked about Frederick II, and we come back talking about these Germanic emperors clashing with the Lombard League, first of all, and also dealing with the problems these sovereigns had with the Kingdom of Germany in itself, that, as we have recalled also in many other videos, had a bit of a trouble being governed by royal authority, and during this time was especially undergoing very important transformations. We will see it everything now. So we're gonna go in chronological order, and roughly seeing Frederick Barbarossa's life essentially from 1163 to his death in 1190. So it's essentially almost 30 years of history. And so, as you can understand, it's a bit of an introduction on the character, about which I haven't been really talking a lot in my videos. Although I often hinted at him, and yeah, I made a video about him, but it was just about his crowning. And if you're interested about that, because it's a bit of an introduction, you can read it. Go check it out. It's called should be called something like Frederick Barbarossa as King of Germany, in which especially I trace what the situation of the German kingdom was and the relation between Frederick and the aristocracy. So, telling you the truth, there is another big chapter between that and today's video, because we're not. I haven't still talked about the first clash against. I mean, in the first rise, say the first journey into Italy, first expeditions into Italy, and the clash against the Lombard League. Not the Lombard League that is founded now, but by Milan. With Milan. And also the relations with the Byzantines. So I'll try to cover this a little now while we go on, but just know that there is more to say before that is not less important. At this time there was a schism going on, because essentially Frederick had with his clash against Milan had worried the papacy, who didn't want this a German interference into the Italian affairs, and Frederick had created an Antipope. Actually, he created two. One also when the first one died during this period, and having been excommunicated by the Pope, he had himself crowned a second time by his Antipope, which is also interesting because it shows you how these sovereigns were actually very in the medieval world in general was pretty careful, and it minded a lot about formalities, especially the juridical ones. Now especially we will immediately get into juridical affairs now, but this fact that there had been a pope up to that point that had excommunicated him, and he needed a further imperial crowning to be officially recognized in this sense was important. It wasn't just not recognizing the Pope and that was it. It was really a matter of, it was also show off. Really, in the Middle Ages, such actions had also a broader public echo that it's very important to bear in mind, because these occasions were sort of spectacles as well, and you have to think also about oral propaganda that occurred at the time. People talked a lot, people traveled a lot during the Middle Ages, contrariwise to what is commonly said. So this was a very big public affirmation of Frederick's authority. So essentially we will start with the so-called Diet of Roncaglia, actually, so a bit earlier than 1163. Now we are in 1158. Actually, there had been two diets of Roncaglia, the one of 54 and the one of 58. So these were councils that Frederick called in these 2 years in this place in northern Italy that is actually pretty close to the city of Piacenza. It was very important at the time, also for strategical for the strategical needs of Frederick to cross the Po River, to reach also to go past the Apennines, and etc. These were the occasions basically to reaffirm imperial supremacy through the Roman law, actually through the Corpus Juris Civilis proper, that is the it was the Theodosian and law, essentially, then eventually modified or completed by Justinian, that at this time was coming back through the Italian jurists into Europe. So this the Roman law was extremely important because differently from the, say, the feudal one and the customary one that existed in the West, it basically sanctioned that the only source of right was the state, in a certain sense, and the emperor more specifically. As a basically all the including the church, all the other communities, including the church, were subjected to this choice. And this is a bit how, in fact, in the Byzantine Empire things had worked. In the West, because of, I've made many videos about this, but I hope you understand the reason. Imperial power, imperial authority was much more limited, and during the 12th century, the empire, through the Hohenstaufen, is trying basically to get that Roman right, those Roman prerogatives back, according to the principle named in Latin quod principi placuit legis habet vigorem, that is, essentially, whatever the prince likes, decides, the law should follow accordingly. It should be enforced. So this had been these had been very important councils, because actually Frederick had come into Italy the first time exactly to reinforce the imperial authority on the Italian communes that at this time were expanding a lot, and essentially not really trying to get rid of the empire, as it could be naively thought, but rather to impose the communal prerogatives on the imperial feudatories in this very intricate system of jurisdictions that existed in medieval times. I made also here a video that might be interesting, especially to make you understand why Frederick had come to Italy in that specific time. That is about the expansion of Milan at the time, and that had been the main reason. Actually, it was the same Italian communes of the Po Valley that had, or at least certain of them, that had called the emperor to stem the Milanese expansionism, because Milan was this huge city at the time. It was literally swallowing all these other surrounding communities, and these cities, as cities of the empire, were naturally appealing to the emperor to have their rights recognized. So it was very transversal. The title of the video is Milanese Expansion during the 12th century. So it is, I would say, first half of the 12th century. So actually before 1154, when Emperor Frederick came into Italy and organized the first Diet of Roncaglia. So these diets were very important because they were attended not just by the imperial representatives, but also by the communal authorities and the papal ambassadors. So in 1154, the emperor had basically forbidden the alienation of the fiefs without the agreement of the local lords. So it was an explicit measure aimed at countering the communal authority that in Italy from the cities was expanding into the countryside, where originally speaking all the major vassals had existed, historically speaking. Excuse me, drink a little before I go on. So even if this is a bit of an approximation, because excuse me, when let's say the communes were the Italian communes were formed not just by commoners at all. Telling the truth, they were created by the same feudatories in some measure, and this was a moment into which the commoners were trying to push these guys out, and this especially through the same actual communal elites. So partly also the same feudatories in some measure were trying to expand into the countryside, where these major imperial vassals still existed and had a lot of power. But through the low medieval rebirth of cities, the power of these rural lords had in fact entered in crisis under this point of view. I made another video also in here that can make you a bit understand who were these communal elites. The video is called Consuls in the Communal World. These are all playlists. These are all videos you can find in the Medieval Italy playlist. So if you're interested, just go check that the dual playlist out. That can be interesting. And I will be keep talking about these topics because it's they are really an essential chapter of medieval history. If you want to understand medieval history, you have necessarily to understand these things, and they're very, very important, because eventually the clash between the empire and the Italian communes had huge consequences for the history of Europe and as a whole, and I think it's overlooked, at least in certain countries. People do not really care about these events. They're more focused on the national monarchies, whereas in others, the Holy Roman Empire, especially in Germany, in Italy, is much more considered in this sense. But what I was trying to say here is that the so where were we? The emperor was trying to claim back all the imperial rights that had been usurped by this communal, by the Italian communes. So this was, however, much more transversal things, because there were many feudatories and excuse me, I don't know how to say that. Excuse me, 1 second. Yeah, the feudatories, let's say. And the same communes were worried about this. And because even though some of them, feudatories and communes had called for the emperor, it was evident that the excessive power of the Milanese now was about to be substituted by the excessive power of the emperor. But initially speaking, this was still contained as a worry, because Frederick put himself as a sort of pacifier among the parts, and issuing this more than else the end of combat, the end of conflict, more than else. So this was was very important into the medieval diplomacy, especially for public authority to gain authority and legitimization through this pacification. The first actually the first duty of public authority was to pacify, because I mean, as long as there is conflict, there is war going on, the major rights of the local communities are infringed by someone at least, and this has to come to an end, to set things in the first place. But Frederick was going past this, because being assisted by the jurists of the Studium of Bologna, the emperor began to define the so-called regalia. So these were the regalia were certain rights associated mostly to the to acts of collection, essentially, of money and other goods that were owed to who owned the imperial title, and this was the most evident mean through which Frederick tried to compress the to stem the powers of the local communal authorities. So the first diet of Roncaglia actually went without any major any major opposition. Yes, it is true. After it, Frederick actually clashed against certain rebellious communes that didn't want to accept his dispositions. We're talking chiefly about Asti and Chieri in Piedmont. But generally speaking, great part of these laws had not even been been applied, basically, and they went largely not respected. Also because Frederick had eventually other problems at the time. Actually, in 1154, he had come to Italy not just because of the problems that Milan was causing, but also because the Romans had thrown out the Pope out of Rome, and because at this time Rome was also one of those communes. The municipal vigor of the Romans was not already extinguished by the papal signory. So it was a lot of, and that was very important for an emperor, to put once again the Pope into place. But actually, the first expedition of Frederick's expedition into the peninsula was very, very tough. It met with a lot of resistance, were sieges, blockades. It was a lot of opposition to the emperor. So the Italians really didn't make a very good impression as subjects for Frederick. Also because the thing was much more complicated than just that. There were also the Byzantines actively backing the Italian communes against the emperor. There was a broader international dimension that we will look at that, especially after the defeat of Legnano, as the whole system collapsed in some measure. Or at least there were major changes into the international equilibrium. So Frederick, actually, you have to think of the cultural gap that existed between Italy and Germany at this time. Germany was starting only under Frederick to be even properly feudalized. The Italians had gone past, especially central and northern Italians, because in the south it was still feudalism, but the Italian communes had gone past this. They had already gone past feudalism. They were creating something else. They were creating essentially city-states. Germany had certain city centers, but there were few and less powerful on average than the Italian ones. So the major power in Germany was owned by the princes, that is, either the lay or the ecclesiastical aristocracies that were essentially feudal lords, that were especially being framed by Frederick through feudal right into the, let's say, the hierarchy of, let's say, institutional hierarchy of the kingdom in some measure. So when the Germans arrived, and this is what also the Ottonians had noticed, they arrived into Italy. They found a completely different world, something that was actually unique in the world even at the time. So something extremely different. And what the Germans looked at these Italian communes thinking they were something monstrous, because they couldn't conceive culturally that there were commoners that were imposing their power, their law, autonomously on feudal lords. They couldn't conceive that such powerful communities could be ruled by people who were not even noble men by blood, as the Italian elites, as at least in the communes, were usually of recent of recent aristocratic status. It was mostly on a sensual base. That is how rich they became. So this in the communes could you could become a knight just if you had enough money, essentially, not if you were noble or not. While in across the Alps, north of the Alps, this usually had to do with to which family you belonged, or to which lineage that this relative emergence of nothingness of the local aristocracies was something much more ancient. Now the main feudal families had been found, and plus these communes were extremely wealthy. They were extremely advanced. Here, as we've said, Frederick was using the Bolognese jurists, because at the time Bologna was the major school of law in Europe, and the Lombards now were pioneering the recovery of the Roman law and its integration in the intricate juridical system that existed in Western Europe, and so it was essentially for these Germans playing in a completely different way on this in this environment, and you can argue that a great part of the failure that eventually the Swabian dynasty had into the Italian peninsula had to do really with this pretty stubborn and an enforced attitude that they were imposing on their on these communities. So as we said before, the same communes that had called Frederick soon grew disaffection to him, because they realized that their domination was turning out to be even more. Its domination was turning even more demanding than the same one of other communes at the time. That at least knew each other, knew what how the politics really were. These were essentially foreigners. So even the fact of speaking another language, it's something that wakes even in the relations. We know, in fact, that during these various encounters that existed at various times between Frederick and the Italian leagues, there were certain, and generally the ambassadors of the Italian city-states, there were miscomprehensions based on different interpretations of Latin, for instance, and that you can clearly understand from these documents that the two sides didn't understand each other well, or at least they perfectly understood each other, but they were trying to force certain semantic meanings on the Latin to the Latin words of the documents to stress, to bring to make the meaning of the document leaning from this or that side, and it's a very complicated thing actually to deal with, especially at the time when there was no real central authority, because even the empire in this sense was essentially floating on other powers. It's not that Frederick was this central authority coming from something fixed and immutable. Germany was a mess as well. It was all a political bargaining for trying to set things right, and so you can imagine how certain relations could really be mobile and fluid and pretty tormented in there. Excuse me, I drink once again. And these, the warriors of the Italian communes were pretty evident at the second diet of Roncaglia. So here we arrived finally at it. So basically, in the second diet, Frederick launched a sort of ultimatum to the Italian communes, because he stated that the regalia comprehended the following. First of all, the so-called arimanie. The arimanie was essentially in feudal era the feudal the royal and personal census owed to the sovereign in sign of sudditance. So this, because it was paid by the freemen, who were called the Arimanni. So here we're talking about about Italy. In Italy, the freemen were still called Arimanni since the Lombard times. So that's where the Arimania actually has to do. So the regalia comprehended also the public roads, the fordable, navigable rivers, the navigable channels, the ports, the tributes that were collected on the banks of the rivers, the exactions that were usually called as telonea or telonea, I don't remember really. That was essentially an indirect, it was a tax over the circulation of the trade goods, on the coins, on the revenues coming from the fines and the punishments, the abandoned properties, and those who and those that by law were taken away from the as a punishment, were alienated to the criminals, and the so-called angarie, that were basically a sort of imposition that came from public authority, and that implied the certain free services that were owed to the emperor. That this had to do the repairing the roads, giving ships or other means of transport, supplies and men, and also the parangarie, that were instead the ones owed specifically to the vassals, if I'm not wrong. This is the major difference. Then the regalia comprehended also the power of creating certain magistrates to administrate justice, the means and public palaces within the communes, the revenues from fishing, from the salt mines, all the goods that derived from the crimes of lese majesty, the treasures that were found in holy places, or in lands that pertain to the emperor, and so everything, all of this basically, this was expressed in this document, the Constitutio de Regalibus, so the constitution of what pertains essentially to the regalia, that was a complete. I mean, sometimes I wonder how really could the Hohenstaufen think that all these things could be asked to these populations. I mean, I understand these were doing it, and I can't find an answer. Of course, they were doing this by right. So definitely, also Frederick knew perfectly that all these rights couldn't be obtained, that all these regalia couldn't be taken, and he was imposing his authority as an emperor, and he couldn't say, okay, now I start bargaining, I start having a sort of negotiation with the with these communes, because I am the emperor and those are my subjects. So I am put on the throne by God, and I'm the public authority, so everybody has to obey me. Okay, and this was very important from an ideological point of view. The emperor couldn't diminish his own authority in front of his subjects. So such constitution was definitely a very powerful political slogan to say, look, now I came back in here, and all these rights have to given back to me, because they've been usurped over times. Italy has been for a long time without an emperor. Now and therefore justice has not been this land remained without an order. So this such imperial rights public rights have been usurped. Now everything has to come back like it was before. Good political slogan, but what in reality? Frederick was perfectly knowing that he would go at war with those communes, because these communes would have never accepted anything like this. This was going on in 1158, 2 months actually after Frederick had razed Milan to the ground. Milan had gone at war with the emperor in the previous years, and Frederick had finally managed to defeat it and to raze the city to the ground. So this was the moment into which Frederick had reached a bit the apex of his power into Italy, and he was exploiting the situation to claim very clear that nobody had to mess up with the empire. But the situation was a bit more complicated. And in fact that's why he went even further, and he basically imposed that every kind of regalia that were destined to different subjects from the one belonging to the imperial government had basically been to be revoked. So everyone who was basically paying something there in terms of tolls had to give everything to all those revenues exclusively to public authority. So you can imagine for this city-states what is equated to. So that is basically losing all the power immediately. That all the communal elites would have been basically immediately taken away from power, in theory. That's the point. In theory. In practice, the situation was much different. and he also avoided. Frederick went beyond, really. He also even forbid basically to sell the feudal lands without imperial consensus. Feudal lands were sold since an incredible for many centuries into Italy. That's how also the same feudal lords wanted. So basically, Frederick wanted to crystallize the whole situation and not to allow any kind of move from these communities that he didn't agree to. So he carried out also, he made also other constitutions. There was a the Constitutio de Pacis, so the constitution of peace. This something similar to was done also into Germany, traditionally speaking. So this is and into which he forbid the formation of leagues among the cities, stopping private vendettas that were actually being carried out both in Italy and Germany in the same way, and that were indeed a major problem for keeping public order. In fact, the same communes were desperate often about this. The commoners especially were desperate about the consular families that were essentially knightly families to fight against each other continuously, and often within the same city streets, so blocking the activity, trade activities, the urban life, and making them lose a lot of money, etc. But the general picture was of this disposition was mainly definitely political, because you can imagine what this equated to. It equated basically to, as we've said, to stop completely any form of local autonomy. And in this sense, I wonder how could really they think to make it that's not I understand, yeah, of course Frederick was rather powerful at this time, but it wasn't this unstoppable power that had enjoyed an unlimited power. But in this sense, the cultural limits, if you want, also pop out, because in order to defeat an enemy, you also have to understand your enemy. If you just put him you put him no choice but to fight, that's a quite risky thing to do, because that guy's gonna fight with all its forces, and that's what the Italian communes basically started doing. Already in 1163, the communes of the basin of the Adige River formed a league that was called Veronese League. This was a league. The alliance was signed in Verona, so here the Veronese League, and it was also supported by Venice, that was not part of the Holy Roman Empire. So this is interesting, because it tells you how the Italians were essentially at this point they were normally fighting each other on a regular basis, but when there was a problem that really encompassed everyone in there, they started forming these alliances. So there were even certain historical enemies into Italy that stuck together during these leagues because of the common interest. Venice usually Venice was worried. Usually Venice didn't care about what was happening into the Italian mainland, because they thought only about their sea trade, and they were really projected mentally on very different horizons. But evidently what Frederick had ordered was something upsetting even for Venice, because they knew that Frederick was powerful, that he could definitely start a war into the Po Valley. Venice had lots of interests in there, and they feared that Frederick could arrive to extend his power even on the city. So that's why Venice basically starts backing the same Veronese League. And so there were this league was made up by relatively important cities such as Padua, Verona, of course, Treviso, and Vicenza. So these major cities of the so-called Veronese or Trevisan mark that was had seen the rise of powerful communities, especially Padua. There was a bit the champion of wealthism in the area, and this Veronese League eventually associated itself with another league that was instead created by the communes of this so-called Longobardia or Lombardia. That is that in language of the time basically indicated all the Italic lands that were comprehended between the Alps and the Po Valley. So this latter league was called, in fact, the Lombard League for this very reason. And so the first acts of the Lombard League was to rebuild rebuild Milan. So this gives you a measure of the material wealth that the Italian communes had. Milan had been razed to the ground actually in 1162, not in 1158, as I said before. It had just been defeated, but eventually was even dismantled in this sense. And so they I was a little bit confused by the chronology, but I should have got it right. Basically, but the important thing about this is that Milan is built by scratch. Just think what it meant in medieval times to be able, in the first place, to rebuild a city from scratch. I mean, not the actual fort even, but the mindset. So this tells you how there was also a lot of criticism in Germany. We will see it later for towards Frederick's policies into Italy, because the same German princes that were completely uninterested in Italy, the German aristocracies didn't want to take the Raumfahrt. They didn't give a damn about it. It was mostly an imperial dream to reunite Germany and Italy and to create a Mediterranean empire. The German nobility didn't care because they didn't want to spend money to go fighting into Italy. And there were naturally lots of enemies of Frederick into Germany, and you realize that the satire, even the very bitter satire, by the way, was done against the Hohenstaufen, and really looked at these Italian communes as, just leave them alone. Why do we have to fight in there? Sometimes Frederick was pictured like a lion, a symbol of majesty, so the imperial symbol in many ways, that was fighting against these ants. There were all these many extremely numerous and Italian communes, and so that every city looked like a sort of ant's nest. So you could destroy the ant's nest, but the ants would have rebuilt it from scratch. In medieval times, everybody was keen on this metaphors with involving animals and their symbolism, and so the Milanese rebuilt Milan And not only, but they build up once again. They built up as well a city from scratch that didn't exist before, named Alessandria. That is in today's Piedmont. Telling the truth, at the time we've said that this whole area was Lombardy as a whole because of the ancient Lombard kingdom. That was named after the Pope Alexander III. That was backing the Lombard League, and that was at war, in fact, with Frederick. So Alessandria was very important as well because it was built in a very important strategical position to keep open, essentially the roads that passed within Genoa. So this major port on the Mediterranean, the Po River, another very important let's say route of communication, and Milan. And this was done also in this sense to contrast the main Italian ally of Frederick, that was the Marquis of Montferrat. It was William V of Montferrat. He was a Ghibelline, so he, however, was pretty smart at as many, actually, practically at every other power at the time, to dislocate between Pope and Emperor as well. In fact, William V had been excommunicated by the Pope Alexander III, but he remained formally in good relations with the Church. Now, this is very important. You can get excommunicated, but it still makes a big deal of difference to wage actively war, for instance, against the Pope, or just accepting passively this excommunication, like saying, well, yeah, maybe I've done something wrong, accept it in a way. He actually also fared into he went into the east as well during the Second Crusade. Then he came back to Piedmont, and he became faithful ally of Frederick Barbarossa, and he followed him in the expeditions against the rebellious Communes. And this happened because the same Marquis wanted to. So the Marquis of Montferrat was one of those feudatories we talked about before, that had that had this that was framed into this feudal hierarchy, and that had to earn consistently from being part of the empire and backing the emperor, etc. And also because in this sense he had very strong expansionistic aims towards the communes themselves, especially Asti was this very wealthy emerging commune from in Piedmont that was pretty close, therefore, to Montferrat. And in fact, William participated to the siege that Barbarossa put on Asti, and also in the battle for the conquest of Tortona. It was another important commune in the area. And in fact, in 1158, William was one of those who basically welcomed the hostages that had been taken from the Commune of Milan after his first capitulation against Frederick that we've seen before. So you find William in other expeditions against the rebellious communes together with the emperor. And Frederick, in fact, used also as a as a logistical ally, as well as the territories of Montferrat were located in a very important strategical position. And William also suffered defeats under Frederick, so he spent lots of resources in also following the emperor, which tells you how much commitment there was in such politics into Italy for reaching power and so on. So there was this war going on again between Frederick and the Lombard League that would last for very long. But the main problem is that when these Italian communes rebelled against him, the same equilibrium of Germany was essentially declining. So you have to understand that naturally the German princes didn't want, as we've said before, to pay to fight against the Italians. They didn't care. And Frederick had managed to rise to the throne by appeasing a bit the various parts of Germany. He put an end to, temporarily at least, to the war between his family and the one of the Welfen, because he was actually a Welf too from his mother's side. So he had been elected because because the Germans truly believed that he could pacify the kingdom in some measure. But now, because of all these expenses and the demands that also Frederick was making to his German feudatories, these were growing disaffection, and the rebellion of the Lombards was seen as a good opportunity to put, in Germany, to put Frederick in further difficulty and maybe obtain something from this, exploiting the situation. And the whole situation for Frederick was weakened also by the prolonged schism with the church. So this had initially been obviously emerged from the disagreements between Frederick and the Pope, but now the enmity was spreading also within other figures, and many of the same ecclesiastical princes that had been traditionally faithful not just to Frederick but normally to the imperial authority were starting to show less sympathy for Frederick, also because he was using them extensively for his for helping him in his military expeditions. Most of Frederick's of the German forces that were used by Frederick into Italy were coming from the ecclesiastical retinues, from the ecclesiastical contingents, because the lay princes didn't really, they had to really be begged, literally, as we will see now, to send forces. So this was an extremely complicated situation. So think even at the logistical difficulties to manage all this. I mean, to be with the communications of the time, living and going back and forth continuously across the Alps between Italy and Germany, and trying to convince this or that lord, this or that commune to participate to the expedition, to negotiate. I mean, and plus the Pope and the international relations with the Byzantines, with the French, with the English. I mean, it's a really messy thing to do, and it was especially in Germany, the let's say enmity towards Frederick was gathering around a very important figure, that is Henry the Lion, Duke of Bavaria, as a matter of fact, and of Saxony. Henry was actually Frederick's cousin. So he was born between 1129 and 1135. We don't really know, by the way. And he was raised actually in Saxony, not in Bavaria, because he was under the tutelage of his mother Gertrude, while he was son of Henry the Proud of Bavaria. And so when the war between the Welfs and the Hohenstaufen had ended, this had taken place mostly in Swabia and Bavaria. Basically Welf VI, that is Henry's uncle, had waged war against Conrad III, who was Frederick's uncle. And also the Duke Leopold of Austria had had participated to this war. Eventually the Babenberg of Austria were incorporating parts of Bavaria as well. So when after this war, when Conrad III died, Frederick had rose to the throne in 1154, and the war between the Hohenstaufen and the Welfen had ended. So because of this, Henry inherited the Duchy of Saxony and the one of Bavaria. We'll see it later, but we're talking about very powerful aristocrats in here. Basically, the Welfen were the major German family after the Hohenstaufen, and what is important about him is that Frederick had basically granted both the Duchy of Saxony and the one of Bavaria to him after all the wars that had occurred between the two families. And this was a very important moment into German history, because basically Frederick had surpassed, through these concessions, the moment of the so-called Ethnical Dutchies into Germany. So what does this mean? It means that Germany up to that point had been divided into these sort of regional scale entities that were substantially overlapping with the ancient ethnical repartitions of Germany. So the Bavarians, the Swabians, the Thuringians, the Saxons, etc. And the local aristocracies had remained mostly confined, even if they were intermarrying, were essentially based on such, ethnical domains. Obviously, you don't have to understand here ethnical strictly meant, especially for the aristocracies that were really mixed. But during the 12th century, basically Frederick imports into Germany the French feudalism proper. So Germany had a vassalic beneficiary system since the times of Charlemagne, but being a poorer land, the feudal estates had not developed so much like in France. So even feudalism had been more ascetic, and that's why the tribal base of the ethnical duchies had been the main base of political and military organization. With feudalism, Frederick was hoping to create very strong feudal retinues to carry out his universalistic politics. So great part of this feudal thing also implied that a lot of negotiation with the various nobles. It opened various opportunities also to the German princes, and Frederick had won his throne, basically granting the Welfen this sovereign ethnical domain. So that now the Welfen family ruled both over Saxony and Bavaria. And telling the truth, much more on Saxony than Bavaria, but the importance is that as it would happen for the following in the following German history, the various noble lineages of Germany would create their territorial dominations on a completely not random, but in a very discontinuous, geographically discontinuous way. I made a video that is called Princely Germany, and that you can find in my medieval Germany playlist, in which I explain a little bit what this was really about. This is a bit later in time, especially after the extinction of the Hohenstaufen, but I think it's meaningful to understand because it's the moment into which you can look both at the post-Hohenstaufen Germany video and at this one of that we said before, Princely Germany, 14th, 15th centuries. There is also another video that is 12th century Germany and the rise of the Hohenstaufen, in which I discuss also a bit this phase of transition as well. So there are several videos you can watch if you want to get, if you're more interested about this specific topic, because it's very, very important to understand German history in that way. So feudalism spreading. It wasn't just a matter of the ancient local community, etc. Now it was about feudal dynasties. And that's how, by the way, the same Hohenstaufen were structuring their domains at the time. Because, yeah, there were emperors, and they were very keen in safeguarding the imperial rights into Germany, but at the same time, as a Swabian dynasty, they were trying to enlarge their private domains as well. So this is something you can see clearly, especially even from the time of Frederick II. And it's a really a very big evolution into German politics in this sense. So Henry was substantially not very keen, let's say, on Frederick, because Henry had begun to build a sort of private domain into Saxony, a very important private domain to Saxony that was expanding very fast. Basically, the Hohenstaufen had said, okay, we keep southern Germany more or less, and you keep the north. So these were two very different worlds in many ways. We'll see it especially later, but it's very important because at this time Saxony, was really growing fast. Henry conquered certain areas of beyond the Elbe. That would be where today's Mecklenburg, and it's a region where there were still pagan Slavs at the time. So he conquers that. The Albo-Treats were this Slavic population, and he settled in there colonies coming from the Flanders, the Netherlands. I mean the Flanders Holland, I'd say better because that's Westphalen, and from Saxony itself. So these were also the ethnical, there was these demographic measures, let's say, for structuring the domains by transferring German colons in there. This broader part of the Ostsiedlung. I made a video about that too. Excuse me if I propagandate my videos, but I just wonder if you've never heard about it. That's why I made those videos in the first place. So I'm sure most of you are already well acquainted, and even more than me, to this topic, but just to make you understand. So there was also a territorial expansion of Saxony proper. By the way, Henry the Lion also put an end to the expansion of the Danes, because Denmark was also a major power in the north, and there had been clashes between the Germans and the Danish, and Henry also sets things right on that front. He founded most famously the city of Lübeck, that actually was a pre-existent Slavic settlement that had gone destroyed between, actually the same clashes between the Slavs, and he creates this city as he gives them very important rights. Lübeck would grow to become the most important city of the Hanseatic League, and this opened to the Baltic Sea and Baltic trade as well. Henry expanded into Brunswick. Excuse me. He expanded the city of Brunswick, Braunschweig in German, actually, and he made basically. We can't talk about being capital, but his favorite residence. If you go there, I was in Braunschweig. It's beautiful. There is actually the tomb of Henry the Lion in there. It was a very emotional moment to see that. There's also the lion outside the church. It's beautiful to visit that. And he made of Braunschweig this very important center. And what I meant before is that he strengthened also naturally his domains all around. And he also basically created and expanded this commercial colony in southern Sweden, in the island of Gotland at Visby, and he asks the Scandinavian powers to trade, to come there trading, and to therefore to project really towards a northern world. So this was naturally a deconstruction of private dominions that could be used against Frederick. By the way, as we were saying, Henry also ruled formally on Bavaria, even though he wasn't there very often. But among the other things, he founded Munich, that rose very fast as a very important trade center, and that became in fact the most important center of Bavaria from there. So really a great expansion. At that point, Frederick is clashing against the Lombards, and he asks Henry for his military help, because he was a vassal of the emperor, and he asked him his military retinues. But Henry, just like the other lay German princes, was not keen about that. He didn't want to spend so much resources to send troops, knights, extremely expensive troops to fight into Italy. He didn't care. So in 1175, when Frederick was coming back to Italy to clash against the Lombards, he didn't receive the Saxon reinforcements, and this is part of the reason why, of the indirect reasons why he was defeated against the Lombard League at the Battle of Legnano in 1176. I made a very long video about the Battle of Legnano as a military history video. It's a tactical as well as strategical history, therefore respectively both of the battle and the campaign. So if you're interested, you can check that out. It's a very important battle, and often overlooked also because of its tactical development. So if you're interested, that's also a very interesting thing to go look at. So the Battle of Legnano was what is interesting is that Frederick had begged Henry to send him reinforcements. Now this is something very important, because you have to think in this feudal world what it meant, what a humiliation it was to beg someone to do something, and especially if you were the emperor and you had to do that in front of a vassal. So Frederick was so concerned and so so square. Frederick was a very squared person. He understood. He was a great fighter, by the way. He was one of the greatest warriors of the medieval times, he had a lot of military experience. He understood he needed those reinforcements. So for the good of the empire, this is what was the most important thing about it. He begged his cousin, so not as an emperor, because Frederick would have not tolerated the empire to curb in front of anyone. But he was evidently begging Henry as a cousin, as a kindred, to send him his troops, and Henry wouldn't. So this was a great, really a great. Yeah, you have to think really of the shame involved into this, of having to diminish yourself individually to obtain it something and not receiving it. So it's something that was not to be forgotten, and the absence of the Saxon contingents brings to this enormous defeat of Legnano. Legnano was a very tough defeat, both from a tactical and strategical point of view of Frederick, and I can't stress this enough. And especially if you look at the international system, you realize that after Legnano, the whole strategic balance of Europe, Mediterranean, and the Near East basically collapses. I hate when people underestimate such historical events, because that gives you the measure of how much people do not understand the Middle Ages and how such world was global already at the time. At the Battle of Legnano, the entire Hohenstaufen system was shattered. Basically, Frederick lost any hope to make it again the Lombard League again. This changed everything, also in the relation of the Byzantines and the Crusader states, because the capacity of intervention of the German emperor was had been so much reduced, and at the time actually Frederick Barbarossa was the strongest monarch in Europe. Maybe the Byzantine, the Comnenian dynasty was at the time. Michael Comnenus was more powerful than Frederick, but also even here up to a certain point. We don't have to think of the Western world irremediably fragmented, and Frederick's authority was really, and power was really, really strong. So this also gives you the dimension of how hard and how tough nuts to crack were the Lombard cities at this time to resist such deployment of power. But they made it, and so this also shifted also the alliances. For instance, the Marquis of Montferrat switched sides to the French at that point, because he realized that Frederick, at least in Italy, was done for. So he didn't he followed the good, say, for his own personal good. So this was a disaster. So you have to imagine this also from the perspective of Frederick. Think to be Frederick yourself for a moment. You have been waging war for decades against these rebellious subjects that you think as your own subject, as a matter of fact. So that they have disobeyed you and that have even taken arms against you, and have a lot of blood has been shed. Thousands and thousands of people have died because of it. Continuous war, exhaustion, fatigue of waging all these campaigns. Think even at logistically, but even physically, from the perspective of the single individuals, how it was to organize all this, and especially the psychological burden of it. That is a greater burden than all the others, because you're the emperor of Christianity, at least of Western Christianity, and you have a responsibility not just towards your own subjects, but also towards God. So think about this defeat. In the Middle Ages, wars were not won by mankind. Wars were decided by God. So if you had lost such a big battle like Legnano, that meant that God's favor was not on your side, or that you had done something negative for which, I mean, we don't really know where negative or positive, but however, God had decided that at that moment for you, that was not your destiny to win. So that it's a great disappointment, really. It's I think it must have been psychologically devastating. And the mess now is not that, well, okay, we lost at Legnano, we go back to Germany, we restart from here. No, it's a complete mess, internationally speaking, in the same way. First of all, obviously the Hohenstaufen didn't abandon their universalistic plans. They would have not done it, essentially, not even up to the end of the same Hohenstaufen dynasty. So they didn't give up. The Hohenstaufen were fighters. But after Legnano, the moment was really critical, because basically Frederick had the Pope, the Communes, the Byzantines, and even the kings of Sicily that were against him. And Germany was in chaos, because now the German princes knew that he had been defeated, and that they could definitely, it was a good occasion to exploit the situation, to expand their own private domains, because Frederick was too weak to hold them. So at that point, Frederick understood cleverly that if he wanted to make it through that situation, he had to break this very compact and I mean, not really compact, but very based front of his enemies. So he starts, and this is why I admire Frederick so much. Before I was a bit harsh by saying, okay, well, he was too harsh on the Lombard communes, because he basically demanded too much. You have to understand it, really, now we can criticize him naturally in 2019, as we know how the story went, but you have to really understand what was the meaning for these German emperors to be emperors in the first place. And at that time, I think the clash against the Lombards could have been won. I mean, I don't think that Germany had really the resources to keep not even just Lombardy under its own domination with an iron fist, because we have seen it, there was no enough commitment and all. But I think that Frederick, if he had won in battles like Legnano, for instance, or others, he might have progressively been able to co-opt the Italian elites to make them, subservient, to make them work alongside the imperial power. And because you have to think, at this time it wasn't, there were many Italians were siding with Frederick. Even the same Italian communes in part were. Actually, the Lombard League had risen, as we've seen, at the point of encompassing a very big amount of cities, as in I think there were even something like 30 Italian communes, and some of the most powerful siding against Frederick. So it was like everyone against Frederick. And but there were still certain Italians, certain factions that were backing the emperor, and they were in that sense betting on that horse, because they thought, okay, this seems desperate, but at least if we win, I will have a greater share. It's been like a bit how the Hohenstaufen had risen to power, because the Hohenstaufen rose to power because they had backed Henry IV when he was fighting the Pope in his clash for investitures, and at that time the whole German nobility was against Henry, and the only one who stuck to Henry was Frederick Barbarossa's grandfather, who in fact managed to eventually make the Hohenstaufen successors of the Salian dynasty because of that faithfulty, of that loyalty. but the Lombard League had grown so large exactly because of Frederick rule had been so hard, so tough, so determined. So Frederick was in this way. He was seemingly a very strong tempered man. He could get furious sometimes. He had this kind of leonine character, but he was he was quite determined. And fighting was one of the first duty, if not the very first duty of the emperor. After all, the Imperium derives exactly from bearing arms. So the clash against the Lombard League had been that important. At this point, he pays for that, but he's clever. So this is what I appreciate of Frederick, that he kept going on. He got this defeat. It must have been something devastating for him, but he had the moral resources to go on, and to go on with intelligence, with diplomacy, with skill this time. So he obviously he kept despising the the rebels, but he was clever enough to understand that at that point he had to act smart and to try to break the enemy alliance against him. So he started with making an agreement with the Pope. So Frederick and the Pope met in Venice. There was a bit of this neutral ground, as we've said before. Yes, Venice was backing the Lombard League, but it was this say neutral ground for many reasons, because Venice is between Italy and Germany. It's part of the. It wasn't part of the Roman Empire, but it was still part of the Holy Roman Empire. But it was part of Italy still, geographically speaking. Venice was, it had this Byzantine tradition, and the popes had a particular relation with. So it was an important trade center, so also for strategical reasons. The Venetians, in this sense, played, cool. They were pretty proud of their diplomatic, the role of their own city as a diplomatic seat. So this was a great occasion, in fact, because in Venice, the schism came to an end. Frederick was absolved, and he revoked basically the Antipope. And at this point, actually, the communes, in fact, this strategy of Frederick's has some successes, because the communes realized that the Pope kind of abandoned them, with a peace with Frederick. So they decided in turn to make a truce with the Hohenstaufen as well, and that in 6 years it would have been formalized as a real peace, in a peace proper, which happened in Constance, was signed in Constance in 1183. So the Peace of Constance was very important because the communes were recognized by the emperor, the regalia, that had been the object of of contention, let's say, between the two sides. So basically, the emperor recognized the autonomy of the Italian communes. This doesn't mean, however, that the Italian communes didn't want to stay in the empire. That would have not had sense in the first place. The Italian communes had never fought to secede from the empire. They just wanted to have their own autonomy. So Frederick granted them many concessions in the administrative, political, and judiciary field. Another thing that he had been asking to the communes at the before the war had been actually to name for the emperor to name the communal podestà. The podestà was it was the head of the communal government. He was usually a foreigner, or at least someone who, foreigner from the single city perspective. That is, that usually the podestà, of course, were Italian as well, but they came from other cities, and the Italian had this very municipal mindset, so they considered foreigner also people who came from other Italian cities, at least to a certain extent. And this figure was very important because, as a matter of fact, it was both a civil and a military figure. Because from one side it had to govern the city according to the local laws, and at the same time to guide the communal army at war. So basically, Frederick had asked to appoint these figures, and that equated to control directly the urban politics. So at Constance, he renounced to this prerogative, and he recognized the communal councils that were elected by the citizen councils, and he however asked the councils to swear allegiance to the emperor, so that he could basically invest them of the formal title, so basically sanctioning their own authority. So this was a formal recognition of imperial authority to the communal affairs, and as long as it didn't demand much, it was fine with them. And at the same time, the communes were paying a sort of this was a tribute indeed, but it figured like a compensation, a reimbursement for the emperor. So basically, these cities paid something like 15,000 pounds every once in a while, symbolically, and they had an annual tribute of 2,000 pounds. That this had to correspond to the ancient imperial right of the fodrum. So the fodrum in the feudal right was this food supply for imperial troops and the foraging for the horses that were since Carolingian times one of the most important imperial prerogatives, because it served to make the army work essentially and throughout the territory of the empire, so that when the German emperor would have come into Italy, he would have been supplied in part by the communes, and the emperor also maintained the prerogative to judge certain juridical matters of particular importance. So the Peace of Constance was a sort of compromise. So the absolute domination that Frederick had hoped for was over, while the communes maintained their large autonomy. So there was this formal recognition of the imperial prerogatives that were there in the Lombard communes, as if that it's always been, and for this reason the Peace of Constance remained a milestone, also in the for what concerned the juridical relations between the emperor and the communes, and not just in Italy. So this had a broader influence also in Germany. So going back to Germany instead, as we've seen now, the main problem was that Frederick had No, well, we are still haven't finished actually. With not even with Italy, telling the truth, because the Frederick had managed to work out an agreement also with the King of Sicily. So he managed to make to engage his son Henry with Constance, who was the heiress of the Siculo-Norman crown. And this was actually a big coming back to the Hohenstaufen. Actually, they would have marked pretty consistently, especially the first half, say the whole 13th century, because of this union. Because through this dynastic marriage, the German sovereign were realizing their old dream of the union of southern Italy and of the empire. So this would have basically compensated in part the loss of Legnano, and you can imagine how history would have been different if Frederick had won at Legnano and he had managed to impose that marriage also on the Sicilians, which I think they would have not done at that point. So this is also a bit of determinism involved, because at that point the Sicilians would have felt too much threatened directly by the German expansionism. They would have also probably come closer to the Byzantines, etc. But what is important is that Henry and Constance got married in 1186, and as we all know from their marriage, Frederick II was born, and just recently I made a video about Frederick, and it's the continuation of the Hohenstaufen. Just like his grandfather, he fought extensively against the Lombard League, and he lost as well, even if the context was a bit really different, and the that's another story, and I already made a video about it, so if you're interested you can continue look at that. And there is actually much else that happened between the death of Henry, of Frederick, of Henry, and eventually the rise to the throne of Frederick II. So I have discussed about that as well, but I should stop saying what I've been discussing, because you can find these things, I think, alone by this point on my channel. So the big deal now remained, however, in Germany. So we go finally back to Germany, and because of Henry the Lion. So at this point, Henry was Henry had reached actually a very large power as Duke of Saxony and Duke of Bavaria, and he had been relatively impertinent to Frederick, indeed, and it could have not been different, telling the truth, because these were two ambitious men, and they probably shared, even, who knows, by blood, I imagine, even this courageous temperament, and there were two bold figures, and necessarily they would have come to clash in that situation. In fact, however, the clash between Frederick and Henry has a bit to be understood. At least I've seen, historiographically speaking, that this great enmity between the two wasn't really something strictly personal. Or better, yes, it was personal, because we have seen that Frederick had begged Henry to send him reinforcements. He refused. He started to basically expand his power more than the licit, and it was this last point that actually messed up things, because actually Frederick's intervention was triggered not by a direct will to stem Henry's power. I mean, More than else, he exploited a chance. There was essentially the enmity that was growing towards Henry, the Lion, from the side of the same Saxon aristocracy, and especially the ecclesiastical aristocracy. At this time, as I said also in other videos, the ecclesiastical princes were a bit like the privileged friends of the emperor, of the central power, because historically speaking, their prerogatives, their prestige had remained alive from their relation with central authority. So if the kingdom of Germany at that time had not completely collapsed, it had been also in part thanks to these ecclesiastical princes. Now, in the region, I think of Westphalen, Henry had expanded a bit too much into ecclesiastical dominions. You have to think of warfare being endemic in here. All these various princes had this local warfare against each other on the local base, etc. And the ecclesiastical princes of the Rhine Valley had therefore grown pretty upset about Henry's expansionism. So actually, Frederick went by the book in here. As I said before, what you see in these medieval sovereigns is how methodically they acted, how they basically excuse me, I was closing Skype because I saw that there is a person who came online, and although I want to talk with her, I don't want you hear the sounds of the messages arriving, so I'm sorry for that. I was saying that there was this matter of the legitimate nature of the sovereign's actions that derived by law. We have seen that Frederick was a great fan of Roman law because it gave the emperor great power, and however, there was also a big deal of feudal and customary law. So in Germany, as generally speaking in the rest of the feudal world, it was a good manners, let's say, to go very progressively against your enemy, because magnanimity was a quality that was praised into both in the Christian world and in the ancient, let's say, Germanic chivalric one, let's say in the secular one, that had also certain pagan influences in this sense, and everything especially had to be asserted publicly multiple times, so that nobody could say, oh well, I didn't hear that, because that was it. And sometimes you have to think, as I was saying before, also about the communication problems that existed in this sense. And so he, the emperor asked Henry to renounce to his aggressive policy. So the trial, there was an imperial trial against him, against Henry, and this was stemming, as we've seen, from the complaints of the Saxon aristocracy, and so it was a very political trial, and during these trials, by law, the accused had to be called up to 3 times to show up. Henry didn't show up at any of them, so this was seen as almost like a, it wasn't really an admission of guilt, but at that point, basically, the trial could go without, it was the king to decide at that point. So Frederick, at this point, condemned Henry actually by a double condemnation, because he basically banished Henry from the empire, and he made these sentences being proclaimed both by a feudal tribunal and by the Diet of the German princes. So he was basically saying, you have infringed law, and plus look that the German princes do not like you. So it was mostly a legal and political sentence. So at this time, I forgot it actually to say that Henry at this time was also allied with England. So when he was banished, he actually had married Matilda, the son of Henry II, King of England. So when he was banished, he went first to Normandy. It was still English at the time. I mean English. Yeah, okay. It was a part of the Venian dynasty of the dynastic dominions of the English king, and also to England itself. So basically, at this point, this banish had occurred in 1180. So at this point, Saxony was actually split, because Henry had abandoned it, and the whole Saxony was subdivided between other princes. Bavaria as well was given actually to Otto of Wittelsbach. So you see the Wittelsbach, what an old family they are. While Saxony was split in the west part, that is Westphalen, essentially to the Archbishop of Cologne. So you see these major ecclesiastical princes that got favors from the imperial power. Then another part went to the Anhalt house. So Henry at this point does something in perspective very clever. He submits to Frederick. So just like Frederick had bowed in front of him for begging for help, now Henry kind of to compensate the situation by kneeling in front of him in act of submission and of repentance, hopefully. So at this point happened something very important especially for its consequences in German history. That is that Frederick gave back to Henry his so-called allodial domains, that were these Saxon dominions around Braunschweig and Lüneburg, that were the core of Henry's domains. So the allodial domains are very important in feudal right because, by the way, Henry, however, went in exile once again because he was granted these allodial domains, but he still had to spend other time out of Germany. These allodial domains are very, very, very important because basically they would have been reabsorbed by the House of Saxony later. Even Frederick II recognized once again this Saxon feudal domains to the descendants of Frederick. By the way, the son of the same Otto IV that had fought so extensively against Frederick himself, Frederick II, I mean. So this thing of the Saxon lands remained there, and it had many consequences for the development of the German kingdom. Because if Frederick had wiped out Henry's allodial domains, he would have essentially wiped out the whole wealth and power. The allodial domains, I didn't tell it yet, were basically those domains in feudal right that could not be alienated by law, not even by the public authority, because they belonged to personally, as personal goods of the owner. So basically, in feudal right, at this point, feudalism was a limited. The monarchs of the feudal system had a limited power. So they could, the public, things like fiefs and all were all public, so they could revoke them as they liked, at least theoretically. Then practically, obviously, it was a matter of political negotiation and how the sovereign was powerful. But the allodial domains were conceived as, sacred in a sort of, well, sacred is a big word, but really, especially you have to think it from those time perspectives. There was mostly a secular pride, the idea that if you want certain goods, especially with weapons, with arms, that is was what these great noble houses of Europe did. You couldn't touch those goods, and even politically speaking, in fact, probably Frederick made this grant to show that if he wanted, he could have taken away the allodial goods, but probably the other German aristocracy was not so happy to see that the emperor had taken away for a short time those goods, and he realized that it wasn't just a good political show. But around that local allodial goods of the Welfenhaus, you can argue that the German monarchy failed, historically speaking, because at that point Frederick really owned Henry. He had destroyed him, and he could have seized Saxony. So this extremely well administered and pretty well centralized land. So with all this great potential, the trade towards with the Baltic Sea, the connection with England, so to reunite, let's say, southern and northern Germany and to create a big national monarchy just like the one of England and France. And instead, he didn't do that. So this, on the long run, would have caused the definitive disintegration of German royal power, transforming Germany in the 14th century in what we know it has been until essentially the 19th century. So these cluster of states with very limited power that, although functioning a bit all together, they were, overall weak and didn't allow a new monarchy and especially a new empire to reform. You can argue that the greatest, the acme of German power in Europe at this time was under Frederick himself. So he had this good chance to make it, to abandon, and this is the point, because such politics would have entailed abandoning the Mediterranean adventure. Instead, the Hohenstaufen were confident that they would have managed finally to conquer Italy and to recreate the Roman Empire into the Mediterranean. At this time, Germany was still capable of conquer Constantinople. Actually, Frederick and Henry VI went very, very close to this. They almost arrived to conquer Constantinople at one point. So the original dream of the Roman Empire, the Mediterranean Empire. So, by the way, these lands were much wealthier than Germany. What do you think Frederick Barbarossa fought so harshly against the Italians? Because Italy at that time had the greatest wealth. I mean, all the trades passed from there. You can realize that from the same wealth, from the same resources that the Lombard League put to fight against Frederick. So it was actually worth of the pain, according to me personally. But aside from what I think now, there have been many historical, historiographically speaking, there have been many interpretations of this. Whether it was better to search for the Mediterranean adventure or whether it would have been better for Germany to shape a national monarchy on its own. There's a great debate around it. And so this was as we were saying before, also the end of the so-called age of those tribal realities that had formed up Germany up to that point. Because these families basically went past beyond that. They got completely feudalized, and they got essentially exploiting every favorable opportunity around the whole country to create a territorial domination based on feudal hierarchy, which implied also very peculiar reorganization of the territory. So also a great rise also in Germany of the trade centers, chiefly the cities in the Baltic Sea, but also in the Rhine Valley, and so also the expansion of towards the east. This was mostly done actually by the northern Germans, while southern Germany remained also by naturally close to, gravitated around the Alps and was looking at the Mediterranean. So you can argue that while northern Germany was looking at the north and the east of Europe, southern Germany was looking at the west and south of Europe. And for this reason, during the let's say the 19th and 20th century, both Henry the Lion and Frederick Barbarossa were seen in different ways, obviously in an ideological sense. Henry the Lion basically became the symbol of German nationalism, because it was conceived at the time in a perspective that is completely anti-historical, or at least substantially anti-historical, that his merits were basically thought to widen and to strengthen the German fatherland. So compared to Frederick's action, that instead was basically wasting the German energies running after this sovereign national dream of the empire. So naturally you have to understand such historiographical conceptions in thinking about what it was nationalism in historiography during the 19th century, 20th century. Today obviously we reason in a very different way, historiographically speaking, but there's always been this great question, whether Germany could make it or not to become a national monarchy, and how influent, and well, this is the moment in which probably things could have radically taken another path. I personally think I think there is a rhetorical of the defeat. I like, even when I study military history, I'm not really I don't like to make revisionism, because I think that most of the times, I like to read history for what it is and how I understand it more than else. But I must say that subjectively I'm very attentive towards the defeated, because history, and I'm not making an ideological point in here. I mentioned nationalism before, but I'm not referring to this. I'm actually referring to the 12th century Swabian perspective. Naturally, the Swabians at this time weren't defeated yet. They had this incredibly lucky event of inheriting the Siculo-Norman kingdom, so that they, in the 13th century, they rose once again to be defeated. So that's when they got defeated, formally speaking, and so in fact we like the Hohenstaufen as this essentially tragic family in many ways. They were a pretty unlucky dynasty, to tell it all, because they had a huge potential. Then when lots of things got in the way, actively in against them, so they were kind of heroic also in their fall. and that's why there's been such a great romanticism attached to their figure. So I know that this is not this video is already very long, but it's important to reflect on it. And I personally think that the Hohenstaufen, especially, I'm very sensible. I think the figures like Frederick I were extremely good at strategy. I mean, they really knew what to do. Now, they got defeated at Legnano, but that's just a battle. It could have taken another, could have had another outcome. Actually, the Lombards were about to be defeated in that battle, and instead were able to reverse the result. So that's also why you have to admire those Italians. But the the battles can be won or lost, even for a tiny reason. So just imagine if, I believe that the Hohenstaufen could have made it, especially at that time, under Frederick I. They could have really realized the imperial dream, because they really had it. Germany at that time was the most powerful state in Western Europe. Defeating once again the Lombard League and the Milanese would have equated to gain a great power and to strengthen substantially their own positions. Many things might have happened, even if in later history that could have granted to that. I'm not saying that with the victory of Legnano, of course, the Hohenstaufen would have immediately, with a snap, recreated the Roman Empire. They would have deposed the popes and made of Rome the capital once again, etc. But they were still in a heck of a position for making it, and they could have sensibly got closer to that. So this German perspective, oh yeah, the Hohenstaufen went there fighting, it was all time lost, what a shame, who cares about Italy? It's completely anti-historical in my opinion. Because I think they were seeing it right. I think the other Germans weren't, because you see that every dynasty that rose to the German throne eventually went to Italy. It wasn't a matter of even the Habsburgs that kind of backed out because they withdrew from Italy, but still eventually also other sovereigns went there again, and even the Habsburgs eventually were involved into the Italian affair. So it's at the time, in fact, the empire had exploded in a myriad of small states. But I'd say that Italy was really the only land that could support at the time the rebirth of a Roman Empire in terms of resources. In fact, the same Frederick II, think about Otto III. He went living in Rome, and he wanted to rule the empire from there. That's what Frederick II wanted to do. Frederick II wanted to create an empire that was centered into Italy and possibly Rome, of which Germany would have been just a peripheral province. It's difficult for us to understand it today because we have these national perspectives, but at the time the universal dream was pretty much alive. I tell it every time in the videos. You have to think that these people really believed into it. It's just after Frederick II that this idea of the privatization of the empire kicks in as something at that point necessary for at least. But even in there, universalism really didn't die the day after. It's something that went on actually for a long time, and there were also unexpected times. Even if you take I hate how people judge just on the base of defeat and victory. For instance, Henry the Seventh, that is credited as this last ineffective ruler who tried to go into Italy to accomplish nothing ultimately. It's actually a myth, because first of all, he accomplished a huge march into Italy. in the first place, because he reversed a lot of the Angevin hegemony that was in there. I will make a video about Henry VII, but he had a huge amount of resources. If he had managed to, well, I can say, but he could, at that point, he could retake even the kingdom of Naples. We know that before dying of malaria, Henry VII was mounting up an expedition, even after being soundly defeated by the Florentines and the Guelph League, and an expedition that could have not been easily stopped by the Angevins in Naples at the time. And instead he died of malaria, and the whole expedition failed. So what if, really? I know that history is not made with if, rather but however, let's say that these systems were still pretty fluid. So there is nothing deterministic, this is what I want to say, into the Hohenstaufen really losing against the these powers to achieve the universal dream. But once again, I will discuss that in other videos. For now, I would just like to conclude at this point. Yeah, this other thing that I mentioned before is that the Barbarossa thought to move against Constantinople. So he launched this crusade that could actually take other paths. After all, this crusade occurred just a bit more than a decade before Constantinople fell to the same crusaders in 1204. The main objective was to retake the Jerusalem that had fallen in 1187 in the hands of Saladin. And the Third Crusade was actually a very big, a hell of a crusade. Participated some of the greatest commanders of the time. It involved Richard Lionner, the King of England, and Philip II Augustus, King of France, and Frederick himself. But unfortunately, as I think all of you know, during the march, and after having conquered Iconium, so the Germans managed even to crush this during the expedition, this quite important Turkish sultanate. Frederick died on the Tarsus mountains along the river Salef, seemingly for a stroke, after a bath in the too cold waters of this stream in the Anatolic Peninsula, and so Frederick died in June 1190, and who knows what he could have accomplished into the Holy Land. I mean, knowing him, knowing his military prowess, he might have achieved a freaking lot. And also in here, if he had not died, that's not something you can foresee easily, but there are even these kind of accidents that sometimes make history taking other turns. So I believe that I will definitely talk again about Frederick. Now I stop it because I realize that these videos are getting too long on average, but just for saying that first of all, we know too few. I mean, really, historically speaking, we do not know many things about how 12th century European affairs worked. We get an overall picture of what the situation was, but it's very difficult to actually tell, well, things had to go that way, because that's how they went. I mean, in today's sociology, history, and the history of economics, we acknowledge that history not only might have taken other paths, but it could have been completely in another way. And that such small events, relatively small events, can really trigger much broader changes. And if you look at the nature of the Holy Roman Empire. You might say, oh well, but the Holy Roman Empire at this point was not. Yeah, the Hohenstaufen were quite powerful, but it was still fragmented. There were all these enemies within its borders. The Italians, the same Germans. So it was a very complicated thing. So that when someone got too powerful, we've seen it with the Lombard League. It was a sort of coalition that all went against these guys. This is how it happened also for Frederick II as well. As long as a power was not too powerful, people bonded with that. As it got too powerful, they clashed against him. This happened in Italy, in Germany, etc., so that eventually Italy and Germany were de facto split into a pro-imperial side and an anti-imperial side that we often read in this way, but it was not even about the empire in itself. It was just about the single monarch not getting too powerful as a secular lord, as a matter of fact. But if you really look at the power of the Hohenstaufen on the international chessboard here, you really understand how a big deal could really be achieved. So, and another thing that I advise always to do is to consider everyone's perspective. You can't fully understand the Hohenstaufen history if you don't take into account the perspective and the reasons of the papacy, or of the Italian communes, or of the German secular aristocracy. And in this sense, you don't have to be limited just to these formal geographical boundaries. You have to think also about France. You have to think also about the Byzantines. At this time, really, the Byzantines were overexpanding under the Comnenian dynasty, and they were about to they had tried actually to set foot once again into Italy. They had tried to wipe out the Normans in southern Italy. They were actively backing the Italians against the Hohenstaufen. They were doing lots of things actually that you realize it was such a complex system. And also these dynastic ties. We have seen, for instance, William of Montferrat. William the Montferrat, that many of you probably have never even heard of, was an extremely important point of balance for the whole international politics, because what the Marquis of Montferrat did could really could really change the equilibrium of the whole international situation. There were many, even here, extremely complicated dynastic ties between, for instance, all the various Crusader states. The Montferrat was pretty much involved into this. So everything could change from a moment to another. Also the Crusades. The Crusades definitely could have been, the Crusader states could have survived at a point to the Near East. Also in there is this story of, they were doomed since the beginning, it was a worthless thing. Well, it wasn't, as a matter of fact. If you see how many resources the Europeans committed into there, and you realize why they failed sometimes, that might have been just because of a battle, so not a huge strategical, a huge structural dynamics that had to make the things fail and to be doomed since the beginning. You realize that also in there things could have been really, really different. So I admit, when I was younger, I really looked at history in a much more deterministic way. Now I realize, and especially the Middle Ages have taught me this. This is one of the, say, magic things about the Middle Ages. When you start studying them, you understand that, if you come from a completely contemporary perspective, you say, things are squared. It's like A, B, C. A acts with B, and even in there it's wrong, because actually, especially our recent times are showing us that political relations, political dichotomies are completely liquefying. So in order to understand, that's why the Middle Ages are so important to study today, because they teach us a lot of what is happening in our world right now, by the way. But the Middle Ages in itself are this continuous thing of, everything is moving, everything is changing continuously. So it's a learning medieval history is a perfect good antidote to determinism. And today I realized that really history is something you can change a lot, not just because of the structure, but also because of the idea, even of the single characters, of what their choices and what they do. And I hope that today I have given a bit of an example of this, talking about Frederick Barbarossa, and I hope that you enjoyed this video. I will keep doing videos about Frederick, so these are a bit just of an introductory thing. You don't have to take it as you know, that we've talked about Frederick, now we're done. This even if these videos last long, it's either in part because I speak slowly or it gets me a lot to tell things right, but it's rather because I you know, I really approximate, but there is so many things to tell, and I can't tell them all, and this is all a very superficial way of telling the whole story. So even hours and hours of me talking actually are just a tiny part of what could be told about such topics. So for now, if you enjoyed this video, please share it, otherwise leave a like, and or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.